What if your mother had never died, that she was just erased from history? In 1944, a Jewish woman was forcibly taken to a LEBENSBORN center, a place that promised life, but hid death, theft, and oblivion. She was never seen again. No tombstone, no body, no name. Until 27 years later, her son, now an adult, entered an SS archive that the German government swore didn't exist, and found the impossible there: his own mother's name written by hand, with a fate no one dared to tell. In 1944, in Krakow, Sarah Levi, a 22-year-old Jewish woman, disappeared after an SS raid. The city was under Nazi occupation, its streets heavy with fear and the constant presence of soldiers. Sarah had been living quietly in a small apartment on the east side of the city, far from the main roads, in a building that housed mostly elderly Polish families who asked no questions. She was registered as a seamstress, a profession that gave her just enough legitimacy to avoid immediate suspicion. But the truth was more dangerous. She was living under false papers, hiding her Jewish identity, and she was 8 months pregnant. The raid happened on a cold morning in March. Neighbors later said they heard heavy boots on the stairs around dawn, the kind of sound that made everyone freeze and hold their breath. There was shouting in German, the crash of a door being kicked in, and then silence. By the time anyone dared to look, Sarah was gone. 2 soldiers had taken her down the stairs and into a grey truck with strange symbols on the side, symbols that no one in the neighborhood recognized, but that carried an unmistakable authority. One neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Kowalski, watched from behind her curtain. She saw Sarah walking between the 2 men, her hands resting protectively on her belly, her face pale but composed. She didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She just walked, as if she knew that resistance would only make things worse. The truck pulled away, and Mrs. Kowalski crossed herself and whispered a prayer. Sarah's family was informed 2 days later by a Polish intermediary who worked with the occupation authorities. The message was brief and official. Sarah Levi had been selected for voluntary labor service in Germany. She would be contributing to the war effort and would be well cared for. No further information was provided, no location, no expected return date. Just the vague assurance that she was alive and working. Sarah's father, David Levi, didn't believe it for a second. He was a tailor, a quiet man who had survived the early years of the occupation by keeping his head down and his workshop small. But when his daughter disappeared, something inside him broke. He began searching immediately. He went to the offices of the Red Cross, presenting Sarah's false papers and begging for information. They had nothing. He contacted Jewish aid organizations operating underground. They had heard of many disappearances, but Sarah's name wasn't on any list. He traveled to labor camps in the region, bribing guards with what little money he had, asking if anyone had seen a pregnant Jewish woman. No one had. He wrote letters to German administrative offices, carefully worded to avoid suspicion, asking for confirmation of his daughter's status. The letters were never answered. After the war ended in 1945, David continued searching. He submitted Sarah's name to every registry of survivors, every displaced persons camp, every organization compiling lists of the missing. Her name appeared on the official list of permanent disappearances, a bureaucratic term that meant no trace, no evidence, no closure. Sarah's mother, Miriam, never recovered. She spent the last years of her life sitting by the window, watching the street, as if Sarah might walk back through the door at any moment. She died in 1948, still believing that her daughter had been executed somewhere on the road to Germany, her body left in an unmarked grave like so many others. The child Sarah had been carrying was never registered. There was no record of a birth, no documentation, no acknowledgement that the baby had ever existed. As far as history was concerned, both mother and child had simply vanished. But someone had survived, a baby, born in circumstances no one could explain, in a place no one would admit existed. And that baby grew up without knowing the name he carried in his blood, without understanding the story written into his very existence. Years later, in a dusty archive that the world had tried to forget, a single piece of paper would surface. Written in faded blue ink, in neat handwriting that belonged to an SS officer, was a name, Sarah Levi, and beside it, a few cold, clinical words that would shatter everything. But in 1944, as the grey truck drove away from the apartment building in Krakow, no one knew any of that yet. They only knew that Sarah Levy was gone and that no one was coming to save her. In 1945, a baby was left at a Catholic orphanage in Frankfurt with no identification. The institution was called St. Joseph's Home for Children, a large stone building on the outskirts of the city that had survived the bombings mostly intact. The nuns who ran it were overwhelmed in those final months of the war. Displaced children were arriving almost daily, most of them alone, many of them traumatized, all of them without families. The baby arrived on a rainy morning in late April. He was wrapped in a thin grey blanket and placed in a wooden crate near the front steps. There was no note, no explanation, no parent waiting nearby. The only thing found with him was a small piece of cloth, carefully folded and tucked beside his body. It was white, worn soft from use, and embroidered in one corner with a single letter, S. Sister Agnes, the nun who found him, picked up the cloth and studied it for a long moment. She wondered if it was the initial of his mother, or perhaps his surname, or just a scrap of fabric with no meaning at all. She placed it in the orphanage records along with the date he was found, but there was nothing else to document. No birth certificate, no parents' names, no history. The institution named him Johann. It was a common name, safe and unremarkable, the kind of name that wouldn't draw questions or suspicion. They created a fictional birth date, April 15, 1945, based on the doctor's estimate of his age. He was perhaps a week old, maybe 2. It was impossible to know for certain. Johann grew up in the orphanage among dozens of other children who had lost everything in the war. He was a quiet boy, polite and obedient, but the nuns noticed that he had frequent nightmares. He would wake in the middle of the night screaming, his small body trembling, his eyes wide with terror. When they asked him what he had dreamed, he couldn't explain. He only said he heard trains and people shouting. The nightmares continued for years. Even as he grew older, even as he learned to read and write and began attending the local school, the dreams never fully stopped. They became less frequent, but they were always there, lurking beneath the surface of his ordinary life. At 12 years old, Johann began to notice things that set him apart from the other children. His skin was slightly darker than most of his classmates. His hair was thick and dark brown, almost black, while theirs was often blonde or light brown. His features didn't quite match the typical German appearance that surrounded him. Other children sometimes asked him where he was from, and he didn't know how to answer. The orphanage, he would say, but that wasn't really an answer. He asked Sister Agnes once if she knew anything about his parents. She showed him the small embroidered cloth with the letter S and told him gently, "This is all we have. I'm sorry, Johann." He kept the cloth in a small wooden box beneath his bed. It was the only thing in the world that connected him to whoever he had been before the orphanage, and it told him almost nothing. In 1961, Johann was 16 years old and working part-time in a print shop in Frankfurt. One afternoon, while organizing newspapers for distribution, he saw a headline that made him stop. The article was about LEBENSBORN children, a term he had never heard before. It described a Nazi program designed to create racially pure children, and it mentioned that many of these children had been placed in orphanages after the war, often with no records of their true origins. Johann read the article 3 times. Something about it resonated with him in a way he couldn't explain. He began searching for more information, visiting libraries, reading everything he could find about the LEBENSBORN program. But the information was limited. The German government was still reluctant to open its archives fully. Many records had been destroyed. Many witnesses refused to speak. He tried contacting Jewish organizations, thinking that perhaps his dark features meant he had Jewish ancestry. But without a name, without any documentation, there was nothing they could do. He was just another orphan in a country full of orphans, another mystery in a war that had created millions of them. Years passed. Johann became an adult, found work as a clerk, lived a quiet and unremarkable life. But the question of his origins never left him. It was always there, a shadow that followed him through every ordinary day. Then, in 1970, Johann met an elderly priest named Father Klaus, a former Red Cross volunteer who had worked in displaced persons camps after the war. They met by chance at a community event, and Johann mentioned almost casually that he had been found at an orphanage in 1945 with no identification. Father Klaus listened carefully. When Johann finished, the old priest was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "There are archives. Hidden archives, places where the SS kept records that were never supposed to survive. Johann's heart began to race. Where? Wewelsburg, Father Klaus said. It was an SS castle, a symbolic center. Much was burned there at the end of the war, but not everything. Some documents were saved by local monks who didn't want the history to disappear completely. If you want answers, that's where you should look. Johann wrote down the name carefully. Wewelsburg. He had never heard of it before, but it sounded like a place that held secrets. Dangerous secrets. The kind that people wanted to forget. That night, he lay awake in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the embroidered cloth with the letter S. For 25 years, it had been the only clue to his identity, and now, for the first time, he had a direction. A place to search. He didn't know if he would find anything. He didn't know if the answers would bring him peace or destroy him, but he knew he had to try, because living without roots, without a name, without a story, that was its own kind of death, and Johann had been dying slowly for his entire life. Wewelsburg was an ancient fortress used by the SS as a symbolic and administrative center. The castle sat on a hilltop in North Rhine-Westphalia, its triangular shape visible for miles across the surrounding countryside. During the war, Heinrich Himmler had transformed it into a ceremonial headquarters for the SS, a place meant to embody the ideological heart of the Nazi regime. When the war ended, much of what had been stored there was destroyed, documents burned, records shredded, evidence erased. But not everything had been lost. In the final chaotic days of April 1945, as Allied forces closed in, a group of Benedictine monks from a nearby monastery had entered the castle and salvaged what they could. They didn't do it to protect the Nazis. They did it because they believed history, even terrible history, should not be completely erased. They carried boxes of documents down into the monastery's basement and hid them beneath old vestments and forgotten church records. For decades, those documents remained untouched. The German government knew they existed but had no interest in making them public. The Cold War had begun, and there were more pressing concerns than digging up the crimes of a regime that everyone wanted to forget. In 1971, Johann managed to secure authorization to examine part of those archives. It hadn't been easy. He had written letters to the Regional Historical Society, to the monastery, to government officials. Most ignored him. But one historian, a man named Dr. Werner Hoffmann, who specialized in the documentation of Nazi crimes, took an interest in Johann's story. Dr. Hoffmann believed that survivors and their descendants had a right to know the truth, even when the truth was painful. Together, they traveled to Wewelsburg in early March. The monastery was cold and quiet, its stone walls thick enough to block out the wind. The monks who lived there were elderly, their faces worn by years of prayer and silence. They led Johann and Dr. Hoffmann down a narrow staircase into the basement, where the air smelled of mold and old paper. The documents were stored in wooden crates, stacked against the walls in no particular order. There were thousands of pages, personnel files, medical records, administrative memos, lists of names. Johann felt overwhelmed just looking at them. How could he possibly find anything in this chaos? Dr. Hoffmann suggested they start with files related to the LEBENSBORN program. They spent the first day sorting through general administrative documents, budgets, facility reports, staff assignments. Nothing personal, nothing that connected to individual lives. On the second day, they found a smaller box labeled Sonderfälle, special cases. Inside were files that didn't fit the standard categories, files that had been flagged for reasons the archivists hadn't fully documented. Johann opened the first folder. It contained medical records for women who had been brought to LEBENSBORN facilities under unusual circumstances. Most of the names had been redacted or were incomplete. But as he read through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. These were not the typical LEBENSBORN mothers, German women selected for their racial purity. These were women who had been taken, forced, used. On the third day, after hours of searching, Johann found a section marked Uterus Program Jüdische Fälle. Uterus Program, Jewish cases. His hands trembled as he opened the folder. Inside were lists, dozens of names typed on thin paper that had yellowed with age. Each entry included a woman's name, her age, her place of origin, and a brief notation about her status. Most of the notations were clinical, cold, transferred, disposed, non-viable. But one entry was different. It was written by hand, in blue ink, in neat, precise handwriting. It stood out because everything else in the file had been typed. Someone had added this note later, perhaps as a correction or an afterthought. The entry read, Sarah Levi, special transfer, 8 months, Frankfurt. Johann stopped breathing. He read the name again. Sarah Levy. He had never heard that name before, but something about it made his chest tighten. He looked at the date beside it. March 1944. Dr. Hoffmann leaned over his shoulder. What is it? Johann pointed to the entry. This woman, she was 8 months pregnant. She was transferred to Frankfurt. Beside the name was a notation, VP-LB, viable for Lebensborn. It was an abbreviation, but its meaning was clear enough. The baby had been deemed acceptable for the program. The mother had not. Further down the page, another handwritten note, infant transferred, April 45, Ref, Catholic Orphanage, 1184. Johann's vision blurred. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the paper. He had been found at a Catholic orphanage in Frankfurt in April 1945. He had been approximately 1 or 2 weeks old. The dates matched. The location matched. Dr. Hoffmann was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "This could be your mother." Johann couldn't speak. He stared at the name Sarah Levi and felt something break open inside him. For 26 years he had been no one. A boy without a past, without a family, without even a real name. And now, in a basement archive that the world had tried to forget, he had found a connection, a thread, a possibility. But there was more. At the bottom of the page, in the same blue ink, was a final note. It was brief, clinical, devoid of any emotion. Mother, incompatible, discarded, not killed, not executed, discarded. As if she were an object that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. Johann closed his eyes. He felt Dr. Hoffmann's hand on his shoulder, but he couldn't respond. All he could think about was a woman he had never known, a woman whose name he had just learned, a woman who had carried him for 8 months and then been erased from history. He opened his eyes and looked at the page again. Sarah Levy. He whispered the name aloud, testing the sound of it, letting it become real. Dr. Hoffmann began photographing the document with a small camera he had brought. "We need to document this," he said. "We need to make copies. This is evidence." Johann nodded, but he didn't care about evidence. He cared about the name. For the first time in his life, he had a name. Not his own. He still didn't know what his real name was supposed to be, but his mother's, and that was something. That was more than he had ever had before. They stayed in the basement for another 2 hours, searching for any additional references to Sarah Levy. They found nothing, just that one entry written in blue ink hidden among thousands of forgotten pages. When they finally left the monastery, the sun was setting. Johann stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cold air, looking at the darkening sky. He felt exhausted, hollowed out, but also, for the first time, connected to something real. Sarah Levy, his mother. A woman who had been taken, used and discarded. A woman whose name had almost been lost forever. But not quite. Not anymore. Johann confronted the administration of the former orphanage with the registration number. He traveled back to Frankfurt the week after returning from Wewelsburg, carrying the photograph Dr. Hoffmann had taken of the document. His hands were still shaking when he walked through the doors of St. Joseph's Home for Children, the place where he had spent the first 16 years of his life. The building looked smaller than he remembered. The nuns who had raised him were mostly gone now, replaced by younger staff who didn't know him. The orphanage had been partially converted into a community center, and the administrative offices occupied what used to be the chapel. He asked to speak with someone in charge of historical records. A middle-aged woman named Frau Becker met him in a small office filled with filing cabinets. She listened politely as Johann explained what he had found, but her expression remained neutral, almost cold. "I'm sorry," she said when he finished. "We don't have access to records from that period. Most of the documentation from 1945 was lost or destroyed during the transition after the war." Johann placed the photograph on her desk. "This document references orphanage number 1184. That's this institution. It says an infant was transferred here in April 1945. I was found here in April 1945. Frau Becker glanced at the photograph but didn't pick it up. "Even if that's true, I don't have any way to verify it. I'm sorry, but I can't help you." Johann felt frustration rising in his chest. "You're telling me there's nothing?" No records at all from that time? That's correct. He left the office feeling defeated. He walked through the hallways he had once known so well, past the dormitory where he had slept, past the dining hall where he had eaten silent meals with the other children. Everything felt hollow now, emptied of meaning. But 2 days later, he received a phone call. The voice on the other end was quiet, hesitant. "Herr Johann, this is Martin Schreiber. I used to work at St. Joseph's. I heard you came by asking about old records." Johann's heart began to race. "Yes. Do you know something?" "I might," Martin said carefully. "Can you meet me?" They met at a cafe near the orphanage the following afternoon. Martin was in his 60s, a thin man with grey hair and tired eyes. He had worked as a maintenance supervisor at St. Joseph's for nearly 30 years before retiring. He stirred his coffee slowly before speaking. "Frau Becker told you the truth," he said. "Most of the records were destroyed, but not all of them. When the occupation ended and the institution changed hands, some of the staff hid documents in the basement. They were afraid of what might happen if certain things came to light." "What kind of things?" Johann asked. Martin looked at him for a long moment. "Things that would have implicated people, things that would have raised questions no one wanted to answer." "Are those documents still there?" Martin nodded slowly. "I think so. I helped seal off part of the basement years ago. No one goes down there anymore. But if you want to look, I can show you." That night, Martin met Johann at the back entrance of the building. They waited until the staff had gone home, then slipped inside using Martin's old key. The basement was dark and smelled of damp concrete. Martin led Johann through a narrow corridor to a storage room that had been boarded up. They pried the boards loose and stepped inside. The room was filled with old furniture, broken equipment, and stacks of moldy boxes. Martin pointed to a corner where several wooden crates were stacked against the wall. "Start there," he said. Johann opened the first crate. Inside were files wrapped in yellowed paper, some of them so brittle they crumbled at his touch. He searched carefully, reading labels, checking dates. Most of the documents were administrative: budgets, supply orders, staff schedules. Then he found an envelope. It was sealed with red wax that had cracked with age. The front was labeled in faded ink. April 1945, special intake cases. Johann's hands trembled as he broke the seal and pulled out the contents. Inside was a single page, a handwritten intake form. At the top was a reference number, 1184. The form was brief, written in hurried script. Date, 3 April 1945. Infant, male, approx. 1 to 2 weeks received from unknown transfer. Mother, Sarah L. Notes: Jewish mother, not compatible. Healthy child delivered to institution. Below that, in different handwriting, was a single word that made Johann's blood run cold. Discarded. There was no death date, no location, no explanation. Just that one brutal word, as if Sarah Levi had been nothing more than waste to be thrown away. Johann collapsed onto the floor, the paper still clutched in his hand. He felt something inside him shatter completely. For 26 years he had lived not knowing, and now that he knew, the truth was worse than anything he could have imagined. His mother hadn't died in a camp. She hadn't been killed in a raid. She had been used, her body exploited to produce a child the Nazis deemed valuable, and then erased, discarded like an object that had served its purpose. Martin stood nearby, silent, giving Johann space. After several minutes, Johann looked up, his face wet with tears. "She was just a tool to them," he said quietly. "They took her baby and threw her away." Martin nodded. "I'm sorry." Johann carefully folded the intake form and placed it in his coat pocket. He stood slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I need to report this. I need people to know what happened." "Are you sure?" Martin asked. "There are people who won't want this story told." "I don't care," Johann said. His voice was stronger now, steadier. "She deserves to be remembered. Her name deserves to be said." The following week, Johann sent the intake form to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. A historian there confirmed its authenticity and added it to the archive of Lebensborn-related documents. The discovery was noted in a small internal report, but it didn't make headlines. There were thousands of similar stories, thousands of names, thousands of women who had been used and discarded. But for Johann it was everything. He had found his mother's name. He had found proof that she had existed, that she had carried him, that she had been real. And he had also discovered something else, that hundreds of other women had suffered the same fate. Women whose names were lost, whose children never knew them, whose lives had been stolen and then forgotten. Johann stood in his apartment that night, holding the embroidered cloth with the letter S, the only thing he had ever had from his mother. He whispered her name aloud, Sarah Levy, and he made a promise. Her name would never be forgotten again. Not by him, not by history, not by anyone. Johann officially changed his name to Johann Levy in honor of his mother. The process took several months and required documentation he barely had, but he was determined. In 1972, standing before a civil registry official in Frankfurt, he signed the papers that made it legal. He was no longer just Johann, the orphan with no past. He was Johann Levi, son of Sarah Levi, a woman who had been stolen from history but would not remain forgotten. The name felt strange at first, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. But over time it became his identity. It gave him roots. It connected him to something larger than himself. He began writing almost immediately. He had never considered himself a writer, but he felt compelled to tell the story. Not just his own, but his mother's, and the stories of all the other women who had been used and discarded by the LEBENSBORN program. He worked on the manuscript in the evenings after his job as a clerk, filling notebooks with research, interviews, and his own fragmented memories. The book took him 3 years to complete. He titled it Name Without a Tombstone, a reference to the fact that his mother had no grave, no marker, no place where anyone could go to remember her. The manuscript was 287 pages long, dense with historical detail and personal reflection. It was not an easy read. It was raw, painful, and uncompromising in its depiction of what had been done to Jewish women in the name of racial purity. Johann sent the manuscript to publishers in Germany, but most rejected it. The responses were polite, but firm. The subject was too niche, too uncomfortable, too focused on an aspect of the Holocaust that the public wasn't ready to confront. One editor wrote back, "We already have many books about the Holocaust. What makes this one necessary?" Johann wanted to scream. What made it necessary was that no one was talking about this. No one wanted to admit that the Nazis had not only killed Jewish women, but had also used them as breeding tools, forcing them to carry children who would then be taken and raised as Aryan. Finally, in 1976, a small independent publisher in Munich agreed to print the book. The print run was only 500 copies. There was no publicity, no book tour, no reviews in major newspapers. Name Without a Tombstone was released quietly, sold mostly in academic bookstores and Holocaust memorial centers, but slowly, quietly, the book found its audience. Survivors read it, historians cited it. And most importantly, other people who had been born in the LEBENSBORN program began reaching out to Johann. They wrote letters, sharing their own stories of confusion, searching, and fractured identities. Many had spent their entire lives not knowing who they really were. In 1978, an association of former LEBENSBORN children contacted Johann. The organization had been formed a few years earlier to help people like him trace their origins and connect with others who shared similar experiences. They invited him to a meeting in Berlin where he met dozens of others who had grown up without names, without families, without answers. One woman in her early 30s told Johann that she had been searching for her mother for 15 years with no success. Another man said he had discovered he was Jewish only after taking a DNA test in his 40s. The stories were different in their details, but they all shared the same core of loss and erasure. The association recognized Johann as one of the first confirmed cases of Jewish origin within the LEBENSBORN system. Most of the children born in the program had come from German or Norwegian mothers deemed racially acceptable. The use of Jewish women, forced to carry children and then discarded, was a darker, hidden layer of the program that had rarely been documented. In 1982, the name Sarah Levi was officially included in the Wall of the Disappeared at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. Johann traveled there for the ceremony. He stood before the wall, where thousands of names were inscribed in stone, and found his mother's name among them. Beside her name, the memorial staff had placed a small basket containing the embroidered cloth with the letter S, the only physical remnant of her existence. Johann stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the stone. He thought about the woman he had never known, the woman who had carried him and given him life and then been thrown away like she was nothing. He thought about how close her name had come to being lost forever. In 2005, the German government officially acknowledged the use of Jewish women as forced bearers in the Lebensborn program. The admission came after years of pressure from historians, survivors, and advocacy groups. It was included in a broader report on Nazi crimes that had been previously overlooked or minimized. Johann was invited to speak at the press conference where the report was released. He stood at the podium, now 60 years old, his hair grey, his voice steady. When the reporters asked if he would accept financial compensation from the government, he refused. "Don't buy my blood," he said quietly. "Just remember her name. Remember all their names. That's the only payment that matters." The room fell silent. A journalist in the back wrote down his words, and the next day they appeared in newspapers across Germany. Today, Johann's son, named David after his grandfather, teaches history at a secondary school in Frankfurt. He is 43 years old, a father himself, and he makes sure his students understand that history is not just dates and wars. It's people, it's names. It's stories that almost disappeared. He tells them about his grandmother, Sarah Levi, a woman he never met but whose existence shaped everything that came after. He tells them that sometimes people are born from silence, from erasure, from systems designed to destroy identity. But, he always says at the end of the lesson, you can choose to become a voice. You can choose to remember. You can choose to say the names that were meant to be forgotten. And in an SS archive in Wewelsburg, stored carefully in a protective sleeve, there is still a page written in faded blue ink. On it, in neat handwriting, are the words, Sarah Levi, 8 months, Frankfurt. The ink has faded, but the name remains.